Okay, thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the organizers to inviting me. I hope all the startups right now stop working and they come here to listen, because what I'm trying to tell you is a little bit about the problems that are happening around this business of innovation. But the good news is I will try to tell you some of the hints and some of the tools that you might use to actually overcome that problem. So I usually try to not to broadcast but have a conversation, but I understand it's very complicated in this setting. So I strongly encourage you to submit all your questions through this Slido platform, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get to this. So, as you know, we're talking here about open innovation. And actually I'm very surprised, and I've been with this business for 20 years, and for the last 2 days, that's probably the first time at the Open Innovation Conference when we haven't seen this picture. Right? For those of you who don't remember, this is actually the original picture from the Henry Chesborough article in the book about open innovation. I think it's a good sign that we don't see that picture anymore, because what it tells us is that open innovation is no longer something new. It's no longer something that people are afraid of or need to be explained about. The open innovation is a reality that we all live in. And it's a good news. Why? Because actually the open innovation creates the opportunity for businesses being profitable again. It opens a lot of the new business opportunities. Because whatever it was called the old innovation or the closed innovation, there were only two ways that companies can do. They could produce things and they could sell things. Now with the open innovation reality, there is much more that could be done, right? You can see, you can spin out, you can license in and out, you can actually create new companies. And another good news is that your cost of the developing technologies is getting smaller and smaller if you properly use the open innovation tools. But the problem remains is that when you develop things, it's not enough. Because just having a product or just having intellectual property is not enough to be successful. Creating value is never enough. You need to extract the value. You need to actually bring that value to the market. And unfortunately, the numbers are pretty depressing. So these are the official numbers from the USPTO, and I think that the reality is even worse than that. The real problems are, usually I try to formulate them in those three statements, and we'll deal with them separately. The first one is attributed to the Canadian baseball player Yogi Berra, and I can give you away, he never said that, but that doesn't matter. This is a very, very good quote that I like. And it says that in reality, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And that's something that we'll be dealing with today. The second one comes from the book of his brothers, and if you haven't read them, I strongly recommend you. There are 4 books about the presentation, about the decision making, about the change in the company, and they say that the organizations actually behave a lot like teenagers. I know how many of you have teenage children or I don't know, nephews or brothers and sisters, but there is something in the teenage behavior that basically they don't know their choices. And the last one is coming from the Nassim Taleb book, Anti-Fragility, and he says that the probability really doesn't work in this world. It's only outcome that matters. And I think all those 3 things are extremely important when we talk about innovation and business. Well, so let's reformulate this problem. So what's going on? Unfortunately, I think what we see right now is that large companies are dying by dozens every day. You can see companies disappearing. You can see companies slowing down. Technologies been developed, but they collect dust. I know, again, there was another old book that came out almost 20 years ago, I guess. It was called Rembrandts in the Attic, if somebody remember. That was saying that we have a lot of the interesting technologies, patents, and that means that there are a lot of good things out there. But remember, we just said the statistic doesn't work. It's not about the numbers. And the third problem is the managers who are supposed to do something. They're not sure what they're doing, right? So let's split it on 2 parts. So one side is academia or developers or startups, and another side is industry. And on a development side, we have a problem that it's a solution in search of the problem. So the companies are trying to stick whatever they discovered into the market, whatever it costs. It's usually a very early stage. It's very uncertain in terms of how it's protected and why. And there is not necessarily an application. On the industry side, there are another big problems. There's not any company today can afford the full R&D cycle. I mean, if somebody in the audience want to argue, please do. But not even Google can afford, and they have unlimited resources. Take me correctly. They do have unlimited resources. So they cannot afford the full R&D cycle. They do need external technologies because they can't develop everything in-house. But the proven technologies are expensive. And it's very hard to deal with developers. Now, the last problem, as we mentioned, is that the managers are really not sure what they're doing. Well, let's try to deal with those problems one by one. I actually usually started my presentation with this slide, and I keep telling people that this is the horror story. If you put it somewhere, that you will be scared every time you see it. And I'm sure you saw it many times in different iteration. Sometimes you can see it as a funnel, but basically what it says is this is the development of the successful technology, and we still don't know what that is, successful product, out of about 1,000 ideas. And again, this is very, very conservative. You can see a picture that say 10,000, you can see somebody say 100,000. So what are the problems with this graph? Well, that's one of them, right? So we're extremely inefficient. Out of whatever thousands of good ideas, and again, I'm not talking about bad, I'm only talking about good ideas, only one makes it through. That's one scary thing. Another scary thing is the x is the horizontal x, which is time. As you can see in those red scary letters, it says it takes about 10 plus years to develop a product out of a good idea. We cannot afford that much time. The life that we live in are much faster. I usually ask how often you change your cell phone. Every 1-2 years, right? So we cannot wait 10 years to figure out if the idea is good or not. And the third bad story is the other x, the vertical x. That's money. As you can see, most of this graph exists in the negative territory. So we're extremely inefficient. It takes a lot of time, and we spend lots of money doing it. That means that there is a lot of failure. And you've heard many times through those 2 days why those failures happen. So one of the ideas is that this is this set numbers, right? So you can see this is from the US data. It's slightly outdated, right? It's about 13 years old, but believe me, nothing changed. And this is a very universal number that you can use. By the way, yes, please take pictures, post it, distribute it. So this is, all those pictures are not mine, they're probably stolen from somewhere. So you can see again, the efficiency is very low. But why they failed? So this is the report that was published a couple of years ago, much fresher than the Jen and George data. And as you can see, most of the problems, for the startup at least, comes from the fact that they develop something that nobody needs. Right? You can see that's the number one. They build something that nobody wants. Sounds pretty scary, but if you add some of the other ones here, like lack of focus or fail to execute sales and marketing, nobody knows what it is. It's basically the same thing. It means that the companies are doing things that nobody wants. And this is the startup data. Now think about the large companies. Are they doing the same thing? Absolutely. They continue to produce products that nobody's buying. That's how they die. So what happens? So this is actually an article that came out, I think, last year or already 2 years ago. Well, yeah, almost, it's getting to 3 years ago. This came out in Wall Street Journal with a big, big title. We have a problem. We're out of good ideas, right? If we need thousands of ideas to get one good one, if we're out of the ideas, we're in real trouble. But if you actually read the article, they actually get to the core of the problem. We're not out of good ideas, because even if you look at US, there are more and more people getting education, there are more and more training, there are more and more brains getting into this business, into the technologies. There are plenty of intellectual property. I'm not sure this slide sometimes come up. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can see it, but this is a graph of the number of patents being filed. Right? You can see it's growing almost exponentially. We're not discussing if it's a good measure or not, but right now this is how we measure innovativeness. So the report that's published every year on the innovative countries, they measure number of patents. So we have people, we have ideas, intellectual property, we have money. The capital is not a problem. You walk into the Silicon Valley, you can smell the money again, right? It's no longer this, after the burst of the bubble, to get a couple of $100,000 for the decent ideas, it's not a problem. Look how many people in this conference are VCs. They come with the money. So money is not the problem. So what's the problem? The problem is we don't know what we're doing. So the problem, as Wall Street Journal put it, it's not that we're out of the ideas or out of money or out of anything. It's just that innovation is really trial and error. So we just really need to get big numbers. And remember my quote from the NASA talent, the numbers don't matter. You need to have the outcome. So what happens? Well, let's get some definitions. And again, the innovation, the word is extremely overused. It's a buzzword. I teach a class of the customer-driven innovation at Northwestern University, and we usually go through the exercise of coming up with different definitions. And obviously, if you open the Google or the dictionary, it will give you the most useless definition. Because by the, I think the Webster definition, innovation is an act of innovating. Right? Very helpful. So, but when you make a list, you can pull out at least two main criteria, and this is something that is very important for us. So the innovation is something that have at least two criteria. One is it needs to be something fresh, not necessarily new. It could be updated, it could be renewed, but it needs to be fresh. But the second part, which is very often missed, is it needs to be useful. If this new thing is not useful, it's not an innovation. And there is one thing that I try to add so that will make our, at least my presentation a little bit more useful is, I think the innovation is a process. Why it's important? Because we compare it with the invention or discovery or technology. And those things are events that we cannot predict. You can't come to your daily planner and write for Monday, 10 a.m. discovery. Right? That's why a lot of the things in companies say, we're developing the cure for that particular cancer. They have no idea. You cannot predict or control events. They just happen. I mean, you can prepare yourself, and that's a whole different story. But fundamentally, there's nothing you can do. You can put everybody into the bathtub, they will not become Archimedes, and they will not shout Eureka. But if we have a process, it means that we can go through that process and learn something. So that's my first good news for you. So I think the innovation is a process, and it means that there are some things that we could be doing to learn, and every next iteration will be a little bit better. So those failures actually become valuable and not complete waste of time. Now this is still a very genuine path that happens with innovation, and we'll talk about that. So we said it's a process, it still goes through some idea generation, the idea needs to be developed, and then it commercializes. And a lot of things that happens at the beginning, at the end of the cycle, and we all know about that. All the troubles happen in the middle, right? That's where you get all the scary terms again. The death valley, the whatever, the chasm, something disappears here. So there are a lot of good ideas, a lot of good things happen. We have some products, a lot of things disappear in the middle. So what happens? Well, it happens, one of the reasons is that we need to connect two very different worlds. So on the left from you, right, it was, if we get back to it, right, on the left, it was a world of academia. It's a world of discovery. It's a world of invention. And those, some of us who are engineers or scientists, what we do with our results, we try to optimize, right? Optimization is what we do in engineering. I have a lot of examples, and I'm sure you can come up with a bunch, when engineers keep improving and improving and improving and create absolutely beautiful product, which is nobody needs. Why? Because in real life, we're not optimizing. In real life, what we need to do is to satisfy. And by the way, that's a real word, right? So it's been invented by the Nobel laureate in economics, but this is the real world. So as far as we get something that works, we're fine. And there's another big difference between the world of academia and discovery and the real world, is the reproducibility. And again, I'm coming from academic world, so I'm shooting myself in the foot. But you know that realistically, about 80% of all scientific data is irreproducible. Nobody can repeat those experiments that you've done. Not because you cheated, right? Again, I'm only talking about the good, honest science, but because things change. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, if we're talking about the product in real life, would you accept that your phone only works 50% of the time? Even 80% of the time. And nowhere in science, and including the medicine, which is not science, you can even get close to the 80% of the numbers, right? We're usually in 10, 15, 20% and say, hey, that's a great data, right? We will not take it as a product. Our product must work 110% of the time, right? So that's a big problem. So there's another interesting thing about the innovation. So not only it needs to be useful, but it's actually not about being perfect. And you probably have heard this old joke about the two campers sitting in a tent and they hear the sound, right? And they realize there is a bear outside. And one of the guys started putting on the sneakers. So his friend says, what are you doing? Do you think you can outrun the bear? And what the answer was, I don't need to. I only need to outrun you. That's again the reality, the difference between optimizing and satisfying. To live and to be innovative and successful, you don't need to break the world record. You just need to run faster than the next guy. That's all it takes. And it's a very, very complicated, but very important lesson for technology developers, big and small. Well, what's the punchline? And again, there will be a lot of information. This one, please take a picture, take it home, think about it, repeat it, again, put it on top of that scary picture with the product development. The innovation is not about what I have, it's about what does he need, or she, right? We're in a politically correct world anyway, right? So who is that person who has this need? Who is that person? Well, that person calls client, or a customer. And again, in the academic world, there are some who write in the books the difference between client and a customer. I don't make a difference, so I call them the same thing. But there is a fundamental definition of the client. Who is the client? What's the relation with the development? Well, the developer gives them technology or a product. Again, we talk about the general term. What the client gives back to the developer? Very simple, money. And again, it sounds so simple, of course, right? So what's we don't need to go to the conference to hear that. Why it's important? Because that is a person whose problem you need to be solving. Remember the previous slide. That's a problem who you should be innovating for. And first of all, again, it's very important, that's a person, not a company. When you hear somebody, startups are not coming and the question is, who is your customer? Say, oh, my customer is the pharmaceutical industry. Out. Right? Because companies, industries, organizations don't have problems. People do. So to be successful, you need to find who is your customer, who is your client, and solve their problem. Now, it sounds very easy, right? But it's getting complicated, obviously. And one of the complications is that there are another group of people that's called end users. Okay? And these are actually people who take something, right, and they say the bottom line, users use, customers buy. Right? Why is it, again, important? Most of the time, it's the same person. Right? So if you're selling me the clicker, I am buying it and I'm using it. But unfortunately, for a lot of the companies, again, big and small, there is no difference. They all make the same mistake. In many industries, the customers and the end users are different people. And there are at least two industries where it's always the case. One is usually people come up very quickly, everything with children, right? So the toys industry is definitely your end user is a kid, but they're not buying stuff. Parents do. What it means, whose problem you're solving when you're making toys? Not the kid's problem. They don't have a problem. Even if they do, you're not solving it. Right? But I'm not sure how many of you are in the toys industry, but there's another one which is even more important. Everything in healthcare. Everything that deals with the medicine or healthcare, the customer and the end user are two different people. Whose problem you should be solving? Customer, not the end user. Because that's the person who will be buying from you. I can give you a very quick example that I usually give. Imagine that you develop the surgical device for that reduces the percentage or number of complications after specific surgery. Who is your end user? Who is taking the device into your hands? The surgeon, right? If you disagree, throw something at me or argue or shout, right? But will the surgeon be your customer? Does the surgeon have a problem to solve? No. And it's very simple to figure out. You come up to the surgeon and say, well, you know, we have this great thing that will reduce the number of complications. Do you need it? They say, no. Why? Because I'm a good surgeon, and only bad surgeons have a complication, right? But whose problem is that? It's a financial director of the hospital. Because most of the time, if there are complications, the hospital gets penalized. They actually need to pay to fix those issues. So, if you're developing the surgical device, your end user is a surgeon. So you need to figure out that, yeah, it should be convenient for them to use, but they're not the customer. They're not the one who buy, and that means that they're not the one with the problem. Okay? Very, very important to distinguish. Well, it would be nice, right? We now figure out that the customer, and we need to solve their problem. Now, what should we do? And we've heard it a few times in some lectures. Well, let's go and ask them, right? Well, we run into the problem immediately. And it's best described by the very famous quote from Henry Ford, when he said that if he would ask his customers, they would tell him that they need a faster horse, right? And he was in the automobile business. There is even more harsh remark from Steve Jobs saying that he doesn't care what his customer wants, he'll just make a product and make them buy it. This is not true. Both of those quotes are mistaken. Why? Because apparently customers are not very well qualified to describe their own problem. And one of the reasons is that there is a confirmation bias. We all have issues. We really don't like to hear things that we don't like. And everything that we hear, we try to turn the way that we know it. So one of those guys were talking about the faster horse. Instead of describing their problem, which was actually that they need to get from point A to point B faster, maybe because they cannot afford to spend the night when they bring their produce to the market, I don't know. They describe the solution how they see it today. Right? So the customers are very rarely qualified actually to answer you the right question. So what to do with it? We need to define this problem the right way. Right? So again, very quick few takeaways. We need to understand the problem. To solve it, we're asking the customers, they don't know what to say. Right? We need to figure it out. And what's important about figuring it out is that the customer is actually not buying the products. And that's another very, very old wisdom. It was said by a Harvard professor in the 80s. He said the customer is actually not buying the product. They hiring them to do the job for them. Well, there's another issue with the customers and everybody else around it, and it's called cargo cult. And that's probably the second thing that I want you to remember and take away from you. The term was actually brought by Richard Feynman in his graduation lecture at the Caltech in, I think in 78. But the idea is, I mean, here in the region it's very important, and everybody understands that the United States was fighting the war in the Pacific, the Second World War. And they used some of the Pacific Islands as a military base.
And while flying from there, they were trying to be good people, and they were bringing cargo, the food, the clothes, different things. And when the war ended, they left. And the local people realized, well, they're missing the cargo. They really like this stuff. So they actually created the cult. You can find a lot of the pictures on the web that they're building those planes or tanks and the watchtowers out of straw. And they think if they recapture what was happening back then, the cargo will come back. Now look at what we're all doing. So how does it sound? If we try to repeat the condition and expect the same results, we are practicing cargo cult. So when you start doing something and explain why you're doing this, and you say, well, because another 5 companies did it and they were successful, you're practicing cargo cult. If you say, well, why, if you come to the company and they say, well, we've been around for 100 years and we find they are the temple of the cargo cult. And the main problem with the cargo cult, that correlation, the fact that it happens doesn't mean causality. I mean, the medicine is a big cargo cult by itself, right? Because when you come to the doctor with a headache and they got prescribed the medication, why they prescribe it? Not because they think it will help you. Believe me. Because they prescribe it to 100 people before you and it helped them. So that's all the cargo cult in its best. Well, another point of the context is that we actually need to understand where things are coming from. And I'm sorry, there's supposed to be animation a little bit, but this picture should have come later. But all those bolts are the same color. Believe me. You can try it, you can test it. There is the paper actually, again, very old. It came in, I think, 2003 in Nature. So all those bolts are exactly the same color. You will never convince yourself. Why? Because with a different background, with a different context, we see them totally different. So you can see 2 blown up to see they're absolutely the same color. And that's amazing. And we can never convince ourselves otherwise. We just need to remember. Well, that brings us to another very important tool that we can use, is that to having the problem and understand it, it's not enough. We need to figure out why the customers are buying those things. What is the job that the customer is hiring to do your potential problem, your potential product? And it's very, very important. And again, it sounds a little bit obvious, but I still argue with my father-in-law when he says, you know, the advertising make me buy things. I said, no, it's possible. Nobody ever buys things that we don't need. We must have a need, we must have a job for them. But not all of them are functional. Some of them are emotional and social. And I have a very old example for that, again, we can relate to, and it's been discussed at the Freakonomics publications, the Toyota Prius, right? So everybody knows how it looks. I'm sorry if there are Toyota people here, but it's not the first hybrid car, it's not the best hybrid car, it's definitely not the cheapest hybrid car, right? It's one of the most expensive ones. Why are they selling so good? Because that's the only hybrid car that looks different. On all the other manufacturers, you really need to come very close to see this little green leaf on the back of it. And the Prius, you can see miles away. Hey, the guy is driving the Prius. Why? Because they have this social need to project the image that they're environmentally conscious. So that's why the California is buying it, right? And the people in the neighborhood, that's important to project the image that you are environmentally friendly. That's where you buy and sell Toyota Priuses. Well, it sounds all that most of these lessons are for the startups. Not at all. The problem is that we no longer have the startups versus the big companies. It's all the same, because we're working on this big business of solving the needs. So the large companies need to start behave like the startup to really survive. And there's another interesting thing happens. And again, being in the region, and we've heard a lot of the different stories about the in the Southeast Asia and other developing economies around here, is that a lot of innovation is actually coming backwards. And that's just to reinforce the point why it happens. So it means that it originates these days in the developing economies, in the small countries, in the very undeveloped infrastructure, getting successful there, and then they conquer the big world of developing country. Well, the answer is very simple, because the reverse innovation is the ultimate answer to the customer needs. Because when there is no infrastructure, the innovation in the developing economy must address directly to the customer. There is no intermediary. They talk to them all the time. They know what they want. They know what they need. There's another little thing to remember, and I think that will be the third point. We talk a lot about the disruption, right? And again, that's another world. I mean, it's not as abused as innovation, but still people start to use it and say, well, we want to disrupt. Well, this is a very simplified, my understanding of the disruption theory. And as you probably noticed already, I'm not very interested in theories, so the only reason it's here, because I think it's very practical. And what's important about that is, and you can read the slides, and if you have any questions, we can discuss them later. But what's very important about the disruption is that it's not a function of technology. It's a function of your business strategy. It's your decision, how you decide to address your customer, how you decide to solve the problem. This is your choice. So if you want to become a startup and grow your business, you must be disruptive. If you want to develop it up to the point and license it or sell it or be acquired by another players, it's okay to be sustaining or incremental. You don't need to be disruptive. It's your choice, but it's a very smart choice, and it's a choice of your business model. Well, what it brings to us is that fundamentally what we describe is that the way to deal with reality that we live in, the reality of open innovation, is to figure out the customer, figure out their needs and jobs, and solve them. And that brings us to the very simple thing. Serving your customers becoming the service. So if you look at the big companies that are actually doing well, or mid-sized companies, or any companies that's doing well, they all becoming services. Apple, they no longer produce gadgets. Long time ago, they say their business is to serve their customer. Every single company that is following the customer, why it's true? Because we just went through several big problems, how you figure out your customer, you figure out their problems, they cannot tell you, you deal with it. Well, if you already have a good customers, it's much easier to keep serving them as they move and get new problems than to search for a new customer every time. So the first thing you need to do, and the first thing that I suggest you think when you come back to your offices or your labs, think, who is your customer? And remember, that should be a person. You need to know where they live, you need to know how they look like, and then you can figure out their problems and hopefully to solve them. Well, it only works, remember we started that innovation is a process, so it only works if the feedback loop is closed. You can't just push it out there and expect things happen. So you need to get the data, you need to analyze them, and you need to make some changes. Because customers change, their problem change, and the market changes. As we said, it's all happened very, very fast. As it was said in Alice in Wonderland, right? So you need to run really, really fast just to stay on the same place. Imagine how fast you need to run to move. Well, I actually have a very interesting analogy that I developed for my students, so I want to share it with you. So this whole innovation process is very similar to making the jigsaw puzzle. And I hope you all played with the jigsaw puzzles and continue playing with them. Well, it usually have the very main piece is a pattern. You have the picture that it's easy to find a piece for it. And then all of those puzzles have a big piece that is sky or sea, that you have absolutely no pattern. How do you find the right piece? By the shape of the hole, right? The weirdest the shape of the hole is, the easiest for you to find is one piece out of a huge pile of little pieces. That's what innovation is. To find this hole, find this problem, and the better you characterize it, the more you know about the problem, the solution will be almost obvious. It's very easy to find a solution when you know exactly what needs to be solved. Well, that's a simple way to show it, right? So this is what we try to prevent. This is what this whole conversation was about. So instead of trying to stick the square bag into the round hole, we need to really understand that it's not even round. It's very complicated shape. Now back to the failures, right? So we said that we'll learn from the failures. And this is some numbers of the failures. Unfortunately, today, if you're failing with all this knowledge and experience that we have, 80% of the failure is a result of arrogance. I mean, don't listen to me, don't listen to anybody, but go out there and talk to people. There is nothing, that you can learn academically. If you need to go and try, you need to find that person, your customer, and talk to them. And still with that is that still most of the failures are because people continue doing things that nobody needs. And then they're doing that it's the wrong time. And they're doing it because they lack of business model and so on and so forth. But the arrogance is still the biggest thing. So try to deal with your arrogance, try to deal with your biases, because we all have them. It's nothing that we can choose, but we can just be aware that they happen. So my approach is, and again, how I come to this is what I practice. So I think that instead of solving the problem, we can prevent them. So a lot of those things been developed and practiced by other people, academics and the consultants, but they usually offer those solutions after the problem happens. When the company comes and say, we developed this great product, nobody's buying it, what should we do? And they start figuring out the customer and all that. So what I'm telling you is, if you start from the beginning, if you start your innovation process with the customer, you will not have any problems. And notice that you don't even need to have marketing, because those customers will be waiting for you to develop the solution. So this is the product that I'm offering them to guide the companies, again, big and small, academics and not, and train the managers to go through that process and to learn from it. And so I'm trying to feed this hole between the academics and the developers and the industry and their customers by this product. So I'll be happy to talk the details. There's a lot of information, but I hope there's at least 3 basic takeaway points that you have from that. And I hope there will be lots of questions here and outside. I'm here till the end of the day, and I'm always on LinkedIn, so you can find me, you can chase me, and I always reply to emails. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Well, now let's accept some questions through Slido.com. As you can see, our code for today is X584, and please show us the questions that has been uploaded on Slido. 네, 질문들 보여주시기 바랍니다. Okay, we have a question in Korean which says that you have talked about the elements towards success, but what about failure? So when it comes to failure, is there an experience that you can maybe share with us?
Well, this is a big question on itself, right? And I can tell you that the United States hasn't been very in the front of how we deal with failure. There are many places that deal with it better. But I can tell you that Europe and Asia deals with failure with worse. Because the failure is still considered as a bad thing. And in reality, failure is, as we said, if it's a process, you need to learn something. And if you failed once, you get 1 chevron. You get twice, 3 times. If you're learning, the more you fail, the more successful you are. And there is a apocryphal story about, I think, IBM, when they were developing some products, and they spent a couple of millions of dollars developing it. They launched it, and it failed. They need to pull it off, and the manager who was responsible for this product came and submitted his resignation letter to the CEO and say, obviously I failed, I resigned. And the CEO told him, are you kidding? We just spent a few millions of dollars of educating you. Go back and work. So I think this is an important lesson too. So if we haven't changed yet, we need to change our attitude to failure. Failure is a necessary product of the process if we learn from it.
네, 지금 질문에 대한 대답을 드리겠습니다. 성공에 필요한 요소들 아니라 실패했을 때는 어떻게 하느냐라고 이야기를 해주셨는데요. 네, 미국에 있어서는 실패에 있어서 조금 관대한 편이지만 유럽 국가나 또 아시아 국가에 있어서는 조금 극복이 힘든 것 같다고 얘기를 하셨습니다. 그래서 하지만 이 실패라는 것을 성공을 향한 절차라고 생각을 하고 매 실패마다 얻을 수 있는 교훈을 얻어가며 성공의 가능성을 더욱 높여가는 것이라고 생각하면 되겠는데요. 한 실례로 어떠한 회사에서 어떤 프로젝트를 런칭하는 과정에서 이것이 엎어졌고 본인이 그 과실이 되었을 때 그러면 사직서를 제출해야겠다라고 생각을 했지만 실제로 사직서를 제출하려고 했을 때 나왔던 경영진의 대답은 우리가 수백 달러를 들여서 너를 데려왔는데 지금 한 번 실패했다고 사직을 하는 것이 말이 되느냐 안 된다 하고 사표를 수리하지 않고 더 나은 개발을 위해서 증진했다고 합니다. 이것이 신뢰로 드릴 수 있는 대답일 것 같고요. 지금 저희 슬라이도에 다른 질문들이 올라오지 않은 관계로 한번 저희 플로어에서 질문들 받아보도록 하겠습니다. Since there are no more questions through Slido, let us accept some questions through the floor. 네, 자유롭게 질문해 주시면 되겠고요.
So you kind of laid down a great foundation to explain the do's and don'ts for startups. But I'm curious to know, step by step, have you seen a startup personally that's flourished? Not one of these large name brand household startups, but ones that kind of follow these key premises and have become something greater, like maybe in 4 stages, I suppose, like chronologically speaking, the steps that startup took to succeed.
Right, it's a very good question, and again, totally in line with what I'm trying to say, right? So stop being theoretical, let's bring some success stories. Well, there are a few things I want to make. One is, I think this is fundamental, it's not only for the startups. The startups are probably the worst of executing on that. So my quick answer is probably I haven't seen the full cycle. But on the other hand, I'm mentoring a lot of the startups through Mass Challenge and other accelerators, incubators. So if you look at this and if you appreciate this process, killing fast is a big success. And I killed a lot of startups, believe me. Not personally, right? So they committed suicide. But based on the fact that they couldn't find the problem, or the problem is not big enough, or on one of those feedback loops, if you hit the wall, there is absolutely no reason to keep hitting it with your head. Drop it and go to the next project. So that I've seen many times already, and the companies actually moved, and I wouldn't call it pivot because they were doing completely different things. But the point is, I've seen many times with the startups, and as soon as you were like older than 5 years, I think you officially no longer startup, something like that. So I've seen a lot of startups, specifically in the medical field, when they actually moved from the original because they fixed the customer. They said, this is still the person we care about. We figured out the problem. Our original idea was crap. We couldn't solve it. But we found out some other problems that those people have, and now we're doing it.
Yeah, I think the courage to stop and move on is also a good
Right, yeah, so kill it
yeah.
fast. Again, it's much more appreciated by the established companies because they have budgets and they have. So when it's startup, you can't tell them, you need to close down. But if they haven't invested enough time, money to make it really, really painful, this is a success. Because they will move on and they will have this chevron of not repeating the mistakes again.
Yep, there's always a chance and always a chance for innovation. So we'll move on with our next question. So let's now accept another question from the floor. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes. 네, 저희 안경 쓰신 두 번째 분께 마이크 전달 부탁드립니다. 소속과 직함 부탁드립니다.
Mandu. I'm from Mandu and I'm a researcher. And my question is that what would be specific steps for finding customers' problem?
Well, again, there are a lot of things, right? So you can go through this whole process called customer discovery, but every single thing is relevant. I would say find the people you care about, right? So we know all the best startup stories come from personal stories. So some of those things just happen naturally, but what I'm suggesting you that you can actually go through the process. So pick the group of people that you care about and try to see if they have problems that you can solve. If not, that's the wrong group of customers. You can move on. Again, back to this point, right? So you haven't invested much time or effort. You haven't done anything. So it's practice. I cannot tell you which one. You need to go out, and you know there's a Steve Blank's book, they can say this, get out of the building. There is nothing to do here, there is nothing you can do on the whiteboard. You need to get out and talk to your customers. And if they are wrong people, move on, talk to other people. Until you find some people with a problem, and by problem I usually describe something that really keep those people awake at night. Right?
Well,
because if it's kind of okay and they have, then you might not have an opportunity.
Well, then a question pops up in my mind. Well, you said get out of the building, then where is the first stop that we should go? I mean, thinking out the box.
Finding the customers.
Finding any customers.
Yes, so you basically, again, if we can get back to the slide of the feedback loop, you're creating hypothesis, you need to make an experiment to test it. So let's say your first hypothesis is that your customer is, I don't know, the young male, I don't know, 18 to 22, riding on the bus. So go out and talk to those people. If it's not right, then talk to other people.
Well, that might be the first step to recovering failure. Then what do you think would be the next step toward recovering from failure?
No, I think it's before you fail, because
Okay.
Because you haven't done anything yet. If you already developed the product and you start with the assumption that those people will buy it, now you're in trouble, because your assumption is based on nothing. Right? So when you already have the data that they really need it, and you come back to your lab and develop it, those people are already waiting outside for you to develop it.
So start with your personal story, then go big.
Yeah, find the customer, find the need, then qualify the need. Because you know there's another important piece that, as far as I have time, I can tell you. There is the worst things that you can hear from the startup or not startup. If somebody come and say, we don't have a competitors. Wow. There are only two reasons why you would not have competitors. And you know the first one and the main one is because nobody cares. Because that need doesn't exist. You made it up. If there is no job to do, then nobody's trying to solve it. And the second one, you just didn't do your homework, right? So again, there's only two reasons if you can find the competitors. So back to the point is, that's a validation. So if you go out and you see a lot of people try to do something and it's not working, that's the opportunity. If nobody's doing it, most likely there is no problem there.
So I'm sure that there are startups in the audience. Make sure that you have a competitor. Okay, let's now move on to our next question. Please raise your hand and our staff will be very happy to give you the microphone. 네, 질문 있으신 분은 마이크를 저희가 전달해 드리도록 하겠습니다. Is there anyone who would like to ask any questions? Well, if not, I will try to wrap up the session by maybe throwing some few key takeaways from you, Eugene.
Well, again, I think my main message is consider your innovation as a process, right? It's not a fixed thing. So you need to create it. It needs to be very rigorous. And when you go for that, be aware of your own biases and your own desires not to accept the real data. So, but when you get the data, you can act on it, not backwards. So I think this is kind of in one simple sentence is the main thing about the innovation. And again, let's move away all the terminology. There is no open and closed. We only live in one type of innovation. Yes, it is open, but it opened about 15 years ago, and it's not going to close anytime soon.
Yeah, thank you, Eugene, for sharing us. And yes, let's try to think out of the box, and let us give a big hand to Eugene for being with us.